Hey everyone, I'm Kendra Abbott. I am an ecologist and researcher in the biology department at the University of Alabama.
And I'm John Abbott. I am an entomologist and the chief curator and director of museum research and collections for the University of Alabama.
And today we thought we'd talk to you about fireflies, their natural history, diversity, and things you might be confusing as a firefly that actually aren't fireflies. So fireflies are something that I know I grew up, especially around the 4th of July, catching them. But I grew up in the north, so they didn't start coming out until probably around the 4th of July. And we'd catch them and put them in jars and, play with them when we were little. So, but there's a lot more to them than just glowing around the 4th of July, right?
Yeah, I think we all have, or at least many of us have similar experiences. I remember visiting my grandmother in Georgia, and her backyard, which is much like ours is now, actually forested, was just full of fireflies, and he would also catch them and put them in a jar. And, the obligatory natural lantern, I guess, that kids so often
and
do.
Competition. How many can I get? Can I get more than you? With my cousins and stuff. So. But there are many species. So actually, not only are they beautiful, but they're beneficial because they have, as larvae, where do they live?
The larvae of most live in the soil and forest understory, oftentimes in pretty moist situations associated with streams, not in the streams, but kind of in riparian zones oftentimes. And certainly, again, mostly in moist situations. They tend to be more common in the U.S. In the east, where there's just more water.
Yeah, and the larvae actually will feed on things like snails and slugs and things like that might actually be attacking the plants in your garden if you have one. So the larvae can be quite beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And don't look anything like the adults in some cases, and look almost identical in others, as we'll talk about.
That's right. And then, of course, the pupa, when they become, they will glow in the larva stage as well, right?
All firefly larvae and pupae, even those with adults that don't bioluminesce, the larvae and the pupae bioluminesce.
Yeah, so that's really cool that you can see walk through the woods, and if you see something glowing in the leaf litter, it could very well be the larva or pupa of a firefly, which is really cool.
So all fireflies belong in the family Lampyridae. It's a really easy family to remember for obvious reasons, right? Many of them have a lantern or a lamp, and so the family is Lampyridae. They are in fact beetles. So both common names that are really ubiquitous in the U.S., fireflies and lightning bugs, are a bit of a misnomer. They're neither flies nor bugs. They're beetles. But those two names are fairly, they're kind of regional in terms of which one is used more commonly. So the reason that fireflies bioluminesce is to attract mates. They have a species-specific flash pattern, color and color-specific, and oftentimes, and the pattern itself is species-specific. And that's so that they can recognize individuals of their species. And so males will fly around and will have the species-specific pattern. That will get females flashing. They will then attract the male, who will then find her and then mate with her. Yes.
We have a lot of species here in Alabama, and one of them in particular is the blue ghost firefly, which when I first heard of the blue ghost firefly, I thought there's no way this thing bioluminesces blue. And but when I saw it, it actually did. To my eye, it looked like it was blue, which I was shocked about.
Yeah, that's called the Purkinje Effect. And in fact, it actually isn't blue. It's green. And you'll see that in our photos of them. To the eye, that looks quite different than what our photos replicate. And the reason is this thing called the Purkinje Effect, which basically in low light situations, the luminance sensitivity of your eye goes towards blue, and so it just makes it look like the blue ghost firefly is shining blue, when actually it's a green light.
Yeah, so if you're walking through the woods, there you can also see the larviform female of this one, which actually the female actually looked green in the woods.
Yeah, she looks more green. I agree.
In the leaf litter.
She is constantly lit up. Basically, 4 little dots when you get close, 4 little lanterns, constantly fluorescing or bioluminescing. And she is a good example of where she looks very much like the larva. It's called a larva-form female as a result. Doesn't look anything like the adult male. But she's constantly on, and then he is flying, making trails, as you can see in our photos, and then he will recognize her, fly down, and locate her and mate.
How many species are there of firefly?
There are about 2,000 species worldwide, and a little shy of 10%, about 170 or so in North America. Again, most of those are found east of the Rockies.
And how many bioluminesce of those 170?
The most,
as adults?
the majority. The males, the majority of those bioluminesce, and fly, but I don't know the exact number.
And I would say when we first, at night, as the sun starts going down, the first things I usually see species-wise are those Big Dipper. They kind of make a J. And that's when the light, it's still pretty light. It's just as the sun's going down, so you can see very well. And I imagine that's mostly what I was catching when I was young, because I was little and probably went to bed before most of these came out.
Yeah, the Big Dippers are one of the more widespread eastern species of fireflies that people may be familiar with, because they do come out relatively early compared to a lot of species, and are oftentimes in pretty good numbers and quite noticeable.
Another sort of famous species is the synchronous firefly, which you sort of see in the Smoky Mountains. But we also have them here in Alabama.
Yeah, so there are actually a number of species that basically are synchronous. There's some in Asia. There's more than one here in the U.S. But the kind of the famous one is found in the Smokies and in northern Alabama, and they're pretty spectacular. When you get high densities of these things. And it's interesting, they're actually synchronizing the gaps between their flashes, not the flashes themselves. So they're basically trying to make sure that nobody's flashing during these gaps, if you will, so that they can see females, is the thought, a little bit easier. So it's the darkness that they're actually synchronizing.
It's sort of like, it hadn't... Like, I thought sort of you just have all on, all off. All on, all off. And that's not how it is at all. It's like paparazzi, bam, 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 off. Paparazzi, bam, 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 off. That's really how it is.
And it happens kind of in micro areas. So, within a particular area, you'll see them doing that. You look down a little bit further and you might see them, in a slightly different timing. And of course, they don't all start off immediately that way. It takes a little bit of time for them to synchronize as they get going.
Yeah.
That's a Photinus species. There are 2 really large genera that are kind of, among the most common species in North America, and that's Photinus, where the synchronous one is an example of that. They don't all synchronize, though. And then Photurus, which is oftentimes a little bit larger species, and they are really spectacular as well in many cases. We saw some that sometimes they're referred to as Christmas light fireflies, because...
Is that the ones that were just sort of constant paparazzi?
Constantly, no real gap. But like flickering or blinking Christmas lights.
When you see that in high numbers, it is insanely impressive. You just wonder, how are they expending so much energy, right? And the trick with that is that they're not.
Well, that's right. That's a great segue. Yeah, so what makes a firefly is that many of them, not all of them, because there are some diurnal ones that don't do this, but many of them have the ability to bioluminesce. And they do this in a very, very efficient manner, where they're basically not wasting any energy in the form of heat. So if we think about the evolution of light bulbs, we've been striving for a more and more efficient type of light, starting off with incandescent bulbs initially. A lot of young kids probably don't even know what that is anymore, but they were really hot to the touch because they were a very inefficient form of light. So we have gone from those inefficient tungsten bulbs to compact fluorescent, which give off less heat. They're more energy efficient. And now we've gone to getting away from even those to a more efficient form of light, LEDs, which give off even less heat and are more energy efficient. And the way that fireflies do this and other bioluminescing animals is with something called luciferin, which is a substrate that in the presence of oxygen, ATP, this energy molecule, and luciferase, an enzyme, produces this very, very energy efficient light. And it's the same thing if any of you have used glow sticks. They're often common around Halloween and things like that. But, these things produce a light that is very energy efficient. You don't have to worry about touching it in terms of burning yourself. That is based on nature, and this is based on this luciferin substrate that you find in fireflies.
What makes this even more impressive is that fireflies do this as adults without eating. They don't feed as adults generally, right?
That's right. That's the general notion, although you can read and see sometimes anecdotally
nectar,
fireflies, exactly, some adults eating, but generally you do read that they do not feed. They're certainly not, with one exception, predaceous like the larvae. The females in the genus Photurus are predatory. In fact, they can be rather sneaky in that they will mimic the flashing signal of other species of fireflies. Those males then come into them thinking they're going to mate, and the females will feed on them. I've actually seen this.
She's a man-eater.
She's a man-eater. If that song doesn't cost too much, we should put that in the video.
I think it probably does.
I've seen this before. Walking around and looking for fireflies, you can observe this. And also even at black lights. Sometimes fireflies will be attracted to black lights, and I've seen Photurus females eating Photinus species at black lights before. There are a number of things that mimic fireflies, some of which bioluminesce, others don't. There are actually click beetles, especially in the tropics, but we have some in the U.S. as well, in the southern states that bioluminesce. They have two little dots at the posterior margin of their pronotum.
That look like eyes.
They look like eyes, and they'll fly around bioluminescing, or they'll land on a tree and bioluminesce. Adults that sometimes can bioluminesce, but the larvae of some species can as well. We've seen them in Peru. There's some in Brazil that bioluminesce, and they're really spectacular because they are oftentimes found in pretty dense aggregations. And again, what they're doing, the idea is that they are bioluminescing to attract potential prey. They're predatory as a larvae. And there are things like phingodids or glowworms that look quite similar in some cases to fireflies, just because they're kind of soft-bodied and bioluminescing. There are roaches that will mimic fireflies. There are another group of beetles called soldier beetles or cantharids and lycids or netwing beetles that will also mimic fireflies. And you might be asking yourself, why are these things mimicking fireflies? Well, many, if not all, fireflies are actually distasteful and poisonous to predators, and so it's for good reason to mimic them. So you will have a number of different insects that take advantage of that.
And not to be confused with things that reflect under UV light, which is a whole nother group of insects that aren't really bioluminescing like the fireflies do, right?
That's right. It turns out that, so that's fluorescence, and it turns out that there are lots of things that fluoresce when exposed to wavelengths of UV light. People are probably, familiar with scorpions that are well known for doing that. Basically, the scorpions will fluoresce when exposed to UV light, except for their eyes, the tip of their stinger, and the first larval instar, the first instar babies, which ride on the top of mom, don't fluoresce. But it turns out that almost all insects fluoresce in some way or another, whether it's just the eyes, whether it's the whole thing. Millipedes and other arthropods will do this as well, horseshoe crabs, but lots of things which I had never really realized until I started walking around with a UV light shining on them. Lots of things will fluoresce under light, and some very striking patterns.
One thing that we have here in Alabama that is super cool that does bioluminesce are these, they call them Dismal Lights here in Alabama, but they're actually just midge, right? Like this.
That's right. It's a larva of a non-biting midge, the family, sometimes put in the family Caroplatidae. And some of these bioluminesce.
And I guess we should say a midge is just a little... They kind of look like tiny little mosquitoes, but they don't bite at all as adults. They're just tiny little flies.
That's right. The flies are, adults are harmless. The larvae are usually found in moist situations, sometimes actually most of the time in water, but other times just in moist situations. And there are examples of these that live in caves and make these very sticky strings that basically, when they're bioluminescing, they attract prey like moths and other things that will get caught up in that, and then the larvae will actually feed on them. And here in Alabama, we actually have these things, I call them Dismal Lights, that live in kind of mossy canyon edges, ravine edges, and they bioluminesce kind of blue little dots.
And if you've never been to Dismal Canyon, that's a really cool place in northwestern Alabama that has these, and you can go visit them and take a night hike with them and see these for yourself.
That's right.
The only other, and this isn't a very special group, the only other place, so we have these sort of in the Alabama, Tennessee, sort of that Georgia area. But the only other place in the world that they have them is in New Zealand, right?
The ones that bioluminesce.
Yeah, so it's kind of a unique, really cool thing that we have here.
That's right.
So Dismal Lights are amazingly cool, and you should definitely see them. It should be on your bucket list. But we have a ton of fireflies here in Alabama, too.
But if you're trying to figure out what species you have, you want to take note of when you're seeing them, where kind of, in terms of height-wise, the flash pattern and the color of it, and those things will help you figure out what species you might have.
Along with this fancy little book, the Fireflies, Glowworms, and Lightning Bugs, this also will help you identify any species that you have in your backyard.
This is great for east of the Rocky Mountains, and is just a fantastic book written by Lynn Faust, and chock full. It's not just identification, but chock full of lots of great life history information about, again, not just fireflies, but other things that glow as well.
Yeah. So we've talked about all sorts of firefly species, their natural history, really other species that could be mistaken as them, including some things that do bioluminesce that you want to be aware of and not confuse them with fireflies or their larvae or pupa. And also other things that will fluoresce under UV light. So if you have any questions about any of that or comments, you can leave them in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Bye.